For this project, let's start off things a little bit different. I want a new project, but I don't want to start with an ASP.NET web application. I want to go to other project types, start up with a blank solution. I actually want multiple projects inside this solution. And one way to do that and control the name in an easy fashion is to use this blank solution. I'll create a solution called Books. And now I have a solution that I can add projects to. So the first project that I will add will be an ASP.NET web application. I'll call this books.web. It will be an MVC application. I do want the authentication to use individual user accounts, so I will just click OK. And one of the packages that Visual Studio will install into this project will be the Entity Framework version 6. So we should be all set up to work with the Entity Framework. Now the actual entities that I want to store in that database, I want to keep them in a separate project. I want to keep them in a project that might represent my business logic, my domain logic. I just want a simple class library, and I will call this one books.entities. That will add a simple class library to the project. I'll delete class1.cs from there. And of course, books.web will reference books.entities so it can use the entities inside of there. So before I forget, I will go ahead and add a reference. Under the Solution tab, select books.entities, click OK. That reference will be there, as well as the Entity Framework. Now, let's define an entity. I want an entity that represents a book. You might have inferred that from the name of the projects that I've been creating, but this will be a public class. It will be an entity, so it will need a primary key. I'll just use an integer ID field. Every book probably has a title, and I might want some data annotations on this class. So let me go into references and say add reference, go to assemblies and search for data annotations. If you haven't used these are the same annotations that you use in ASP.NET MVC to mark things as required. For instance, just need to bring in that namespace, system.componentModel.dataAnnotations. Title will be required. Title will also have a maximum string length of 255 characters. And I don't want to make this too complicated because the features that I want to demonstrate don't rely on anything fancy in the model or in the entities, but I do want to create an enum and show you how to work with those. So let me create another class, this one called genre, and this will represent the different categories of books. So this will be a public enum. And let's just put a few items in here. We will have a nonfiction category, a romance category, an action category, and let's say science fiction. That should be enough to get started. And then every book will have a property of type genre. Let me call it category. Do a quick build just to make sure we're okay. And everything is building and succeeding so far. Now I have a very simple entity defined that uses an enum. I want to set up things to work with SQL Server through the Entity Framework. So I'm going to add a new folder to my web project called Data Contexts. So book.entities defines the pure entities. There can be some business logic in there, but I don't want infrastructure things like the Entity Framework. I can use that from a different assembly that ties together my entities to a specific DB context. It's the DB context that we use to talk to the database. So for example, inside of this folder, let me add a class. This one called BooksDB. And this will represent my gateway to the database to query anything book related. So it will derive from the Entity Framework DB context class from system.data.entity. And it will have a public property of type dbSet that works against book. Let me see if I can bring in that namespace with Visual Studio. Sometimes it's a little picky about this, so I'll add this manually. Books.entities is where book resides, and this property will be called books. So if you haven't worked with the Entity Framework before, or you just need a little bit of a refresher, when you declare a class that's derived from DB context and you give it dbSet properties, dbSet for the most part will map to a table. So there should be a books table that contains book information. And when I instantiate an instance of this class, I can walk up to books and it's queryable. So I can use link operators to do sorting and paging and grouping and joining, all those interesting things. The entity framework will take those link queries and translate them into SQL and give me back book objects. I can also use a DB set to add and insert new books. Now, the reason I named this folder Data Contexts is because I actually want to keep all of my data contexts for this web application inside of the same folder. There's just one place to manage this data stuff, and it could certainly be in a different assembly than the website, but I'm just going to work with two projects, the website, and then there's everything else which represents the business. And the website contains the UI and the infrastructure. The other data context that I want to add in here is one that's already been defined. We saw this in the module about ASP.NET Identity. This is the application DB context. This is the code that automatically comes out of the box when you do a file new MVC project. It's the database context that derives from Identity DB context, so it is the one that knows how to store user information. Users, roles, passwords, logins, all of that information goes into here. And that's not something that I need to worry about when I'm using books. I might need to authorize users, but I sort of have two separate sections of information inside of the database, one related to users and whatever tables we need there, and another part that is the book information that I will need when a user wants to list all the books and add new books and edit books. And I want to take this DB context and really cut it out of here, leaving behind just the application user, which I could customize, and add this DB context into the other folder. But before I do that, you might be wondering how you can define a user in your core entities assembly. That's going to be slightly tricky because the implementation that we saw in that identity module, we know that the default user manager that comes out of the box with ASP.NET Identity requires an identity user, which isn't a big deal. You could certainly define your own something user, application user, whatever, and put that into books.entities. The only problem is that identity user, you have to use that type, and that type lives in the ASP.NET.Identity.Entity framework assembly, which means your business logic or your domain logic assembly would need a reference to the entity framework, and that's not going to work for a lot of people. It's rather distasteful. Fortunately, I'm not going to consider user a core entity here. That's just sort of webby stuff where we have to manage logins and passwords, but I'm not going to build any UI around managing users. It's not part of the core focus for this application. So I will just leave application user here. But if you truly wanted a clean user, that might be a scenario where you have to implement your own user store and user manager, just like we talked about in the security module. For now, let me add a new class to data contexts. I will call this identity DB and add this. Only I'll remove the class that's in there. I do still want it called, though, identity DB. And that means I'll have to rename the constructor. And I also need to bring in a namespace for that Microsoft.ASP.NET.Identity.Entity framework namespace. That's where identity DB context is defined. And now application user, also in a slightly different namespace. So I think we have fixed this up to the point where we can use it. But when I look at this constructor, I am reminded of one thing. I actually want to use the same connection string from BooksDB. So I will have two data contexts, but they're both going to talk to the same database through the same database connections. They're just going to work with different tables. In fact, I hope to reach a point where they work with different tables in different schemas in that database. But let's see if we can get there. What I have so far is an entity defined in books.entities. That's just a simple book so far. But I could certainly add more information there. And then I have some data contexts set up to manage my users, to manage my books. They're both going to use the same connection string. And what we'll look at next is how to use migrations so that we can create and update SQL Server databases using these two DB context classes. And then once we have a database, we'll move on and start querying and adding information to the database using our ASP.NET MVC controllers and views.